Germany calling. Here are the Reichsender ambush, Station Bremen, and Station DXB on the 31-meter band.
This evening, I am talking to you about Germany. That is a concept that many of you may have failed to understand. Let me tell you that in Germany, there still remains the spirit of unity and the spirit of strength. Let me tell you that here we have a united people who are modest in their wishes. They are not imperialists. They don't want to take what doesn't belong to them. All they want is to live their own simple lives, undisturbed by outside influences. I can remember when I cast my memory back to 1932 and 1931, I can remember how everything that could be done to stimulate the hatred of England against Germany was done. I ask you to remember that in 1939, in August, the only question was that of bringing Danzig back to the Reich. No more and no less. What a small problem that was in comparison with those that confront us today. Surely, if only we had had the common sense to agree that the German people of Danzig should go back to the Reich, then we might have had peace. Now I say to you, my English listeners, the trouble is this. Germany, if you like, is not anymore the chief factor in Europe. Germany may be, I may be wrong, I will only say that the German arms have been in many battlefields defeated. But I ask you, how could it ever be possible for England to maintain a front against Soviet Russia unless she had the help of the German legions? I can only say that I have day in and day out called the attention of the British people to the menace from the east which confronted them. And if they will not hear, if they are determined not to hear, then I can only say that the fate which overcomes them in the end will be the fate they have merited. More I cannot say. And I beg you to realize that the fight is on. You have heard something about the Battle of Berlin. You know that there a tremendous world-shattering conflict is being waged. Good. I would only say that the men who have died in the Battle of Berlin have given their lives to show that whatever else happens, Germany will live. And therefore I say to you, In these last words, you may not hear from me again for a few months. I say, es lebe Deutschland. Heil Hitler, and farewell.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time, dearly.
На полный разгром гнусских захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Germany calling, Germany calling. Welcome to the show. I'm Nick, and I'm joined by Adam and Hank. How are you guys?
Good. Hi.
Fantastic.
Today we are going to talk about a little-known and much-derided figure from 20th century history, William Joyce, otherwise known as Lord Haha, who was a dedicated National Socialist polemicist and fellow podcaster who was executed by the perverse and degenerate British state following the triumph of liberal capitalism in the European War in 1945. So, where to begin? Joyce was born in New York, interestingly enough. Despite his eventual execution for the crimes of high treason, he was actually never really a British citizen, which is kind of ironic, I guess. However, his family, of course, was Irish, Anglo-Scottish blood. His family were Crown Loyalists living in Ireland through the Troubles. So after being born in 1906, they moved shortly thereafter back to Ireland, where they lost nearly everything that they had in the Troubles. The early Troubles, I guess.
Was this the war for Irish independence?
Yeah, well, it was because
the Troubles is a term that's applied to like the 90s, and that's obviously not what you're talking about.
Well, no, it's applied before the 90s as well, but yes, the early 20th century Troubles in Ireland with the Crown. He joined the British fascists, or the fascisti, I think they were called initially. They changed their name to the British fascists in the early 1920s. And that was a kind of short-lived experiment in British fascism, and he came to, of course, join with the Mosleyites, the British Union of Fascists, in the 1930s, in 1933 specifically, and he was made director of propaganda. Now, he gained his notoriety when he eventually left with his second wife for Germany in August of 1939, where he became a podcaster, for the Reich in the English language section.
Want to make it explicit that this is the world's first alt-right podcaster that we are now doing a biography of.
Yeah, a brief biography. The question I want to answer today is because his name, Lord Haha, which interestingly was actually given. People didn't. He eventually self-doxed because he was an anon for a while, and Lord Haha was, because of the inept nature of British wartime propaganda, it was falsely attributed to him when actually they were referring to another man, but the name, for better or for worse, ended up sticking. So eventually, when he was forced, or rather felt that it was time to, because he applied for German citizenship, he took a few years to get that. And I believe it wasn't until 1941 that he and his wife were given German citizenship. He also registered for military service in Germany, and he stated, "I, William Joyce, left England because I would not fight for Jewry against Adolf Hitler and National Socialism. I left England because I thought a victory which would preserve existing conditions would be more damaging to Britain than defeat." And the thing that needs to be understood about William Joyce was Lord Ha-Ha became synonymous with, he is basically the Anglo equivalent of Quisling, like Vidkun Quisling, right?
The Norwegian person, I can't remember exactly what his position was, but he was in the government, I believe, who was responsible for sort of
he was the head of
collaborationist prime minister.
Yeah, with the Nazi occupation in Norway. So,
well, the thing I should emphasize from the outset about Joyce was he was a British patriot through and through. And minor evidence of this would be the fact that he defaced his own passport so that it could not be used by German intelligence. But he was put in a difficult position, and his great polemic that was published in 1940, Twilight over England, which itself has a lot of relevance today. It really is sort of the work of a man who's suffering anguish between divided loyalties to his people, to his race. But when the state that presided over the Isles was doing everything it could to destroy all of the above. So I must emphasize that, yes, he was in fact a British patriot.
Who gave him the microphone? Because obviously when you're in wartime Germany, World War II Germany, you're not exactly granted the license to speak over the airways without some approval from the propaganda ministry. I don't know if it went up to Goebbels, but basically it was a very controlled system, especially around information. And there was a short documentary I did to get some background on this, and it was basically explaining, the British people who were being interviewed at least were explaining that the Germans were very censorship prone, and so they would not exactly allow anybody on the air, in contrast with the British, who were obviously exercising quite a bit of censorship.
Quite the opposite, Adam, quite the opposite.
Well, let me finish. Basically, they were explaining that the British allowed him to be on the air because they were worried that the British public would perceive that as, or it wasn't. First of all, you can't really jam the signals of a particular frequency unless you want to sort of disrupt a lot of traffic. So censorship at the source is a lot easier, in other words, than intercepting it after it's been broadcast. And Germany and Britain are fairly close together, and when, I don't know when he was broadcasting, but he could have been even having a transmitter right, on the cliffs of close across the English Channel, basically. And so that's only about 70 miles. And so to intercept that, through the airwaves is practically difficult. And so the only thing you could do is just make it illegal to listen to him. But in practice, people still would listen. And the decision was made by the British Home Office or whoever was responsible for this, that would be sort of a less preferable thing to do because the public would dislike that and view the government as trying to hide something. So that was my point.
Yeah, well, why precise? They thought that they could make use him as to further their own wartime propaganda.
The Germans, you mean?
The British. The
oh,
Germans.
Yeah, you could view it that way, and that would make a lot of sense because if they viewed him as sort of a laughable figure, then this is sort of somebody they could use. I don't know.
His broadcasts, by the way, are quite funny.
The name Germany, Lord Ha-Ha, that doesn't sound like a compliment, so it sounds a little bit derisory. Well,
that was from the British Jewish press, but
right.
In Germany, he was able to publish his book without any trouble, and it was comparing the restrictions of thought under the Jewish press of England versus Germany. It's actually comes out favorable to Germany. There's quite a lot that you could say, provided you weren't propagandizing against the German people and German
state. Do you know, though, if it was sort of an approved, in stamped, fashion that the German bureaucracy was famous for, to have him on the air? Or was he doing this basically from his sort of like cottage?
No, he was.
Somewhere?
Yeah, he was brought in. I mean, it took him a little
funding for that from the government.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he consistently denied pay raises as well. He was largely a very humble man, and he got his in. I mean, there were various BUF members with close ties to Germany who.
Do you know? Sorry, go ahead. I'll ask a question after that.
Well, on the eve of the war, there were various BUF members who would start, the ones who had stronger ties in Germany, who left for Germany.
I was going to ask,
and one of those in particular was a woman named Frances Dorothy Eckersley, who he initially contacted and asked her to put him in touch with Goebbels in the service of him becoming a German citizen.
Who gave him the scripts? Did he write them, or was it provided to him?
He wrote them. He was a brilliant writer.
Did it have to be reviewed? You may not know this level of detail, but I'm curious if there was some level of censorship placed on what he had to say, at the very least.
No, I don't believe so. I think they were just happy for him to be broadcasting in favor of Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, he did run into some conflict at one point, which was in the later part of the war. He got into it with he was eventually charged with the very comical sub-treason.
What does that mean? Sub-treason.
I guess presumably he had already committed treason, so it's sub-treason. He got into a fight. That's all it came down to. A fist fight. And he was, I should add this too, I mean, he was more to his personal background. After joining, he was, if you look at a picture of Joyce, you'll notice, of course, the large scar on his face. That was
also known as the Irish smile, I believe.
Yeah. It was given him by a Jewish communist street agitator with a razor blade. He was wearing a fairly thick scarf, and so
there's an Irish actor today who has that same scar. I forget his name, but he portrayed one of the characters on Sons of Anarchy. He's pretty famous for that. And he got that basically in one of these sort of street environments.
Yeah, he was a fighter. He was a well-educated man. He, due to, as I mentioned, his family's financial hardships, because of their loyalty to the crown, living in Ireland, they didn't have quite enough money for him to finish his master's program, but studied literature and economics and psychology, etc., etc. He also, when he was laid up in later years, he studied some other fields, but he was a well-read man. He made his money on the side in addition to his fascist political activities, tutoring. He, of course, refused to tutor Jewish students, which brought him some trouble, as it frequently does. And he was put through the same tribulations as many of the Mosleyites, being arrested at various points. In fact, another arrest, which would have caught up Mosley as well, was imminent before he had left for Germany. So another reason for him to leave. But the real reasons that he left for Germany are best understood by reading his book. Twilight over England. And in the book, he details, it's one of the best books explaining, for lack of a better term, the English question. And why it is that this empire behaved so perversely and why it waged war against Europe, why it waged war against Germany. And he has some very cogent insights to that end. He goes through the historical perversion of England, from the ascendancy of Cromwell and Puritanism to the general dilemma of money over blood. Included in that is,
I think that's what it comes down to. It's also power. I mean, the British Empire sought to dominate, and Germany was the chief rival to that.
Well, yeah, and it was a threat to the international financial system, which, is the chief cause of the war, which he goes into great detail about. He has some very good insights as to the nature of the English problem. And he describes he goes from everything from the founding of the Bank of England and to the crown becoming essentially a nominal figurehead in power, and in the nature of parliamentary politics. I could read a few quotes actually from this book. I have several. He talks a lot about the way in which the party politics became the sham that it was, with this struggle, of course, in English politics between town and country and money and blood, and the increasing impotency of the old landed aristocrats. And one thing that he identifies that I thought was very good, he was a big fan, by the way, of Thomas Carlyle, as you can imagine. He, in fact, called Thomas Carlyle one of the first proponents of National Socialist thought.
So if I can briefly comment on Thomas Carlyle, I didn't know who he was until a few years ago, and the introduction I got from sort of people in our circles about him was he was sort of, ironically, the anti-Adam Smith, and he, I think, literally critiqued, that dismal economist over there with his pin factory, and he kind of tried to create a contrast between the sort of rising merchant class of the Industrial Revolution with the sort of previous aristocracy, which was much more landed and frankly just based on military power. So that was my brief introduction, but I'm not by no means an expert on him.
Well, it's not a show today on Thomas Carlyle that is worth its own episode, frankly, but he details the rise of the Puritans and Whiggery. I mean, it's the book itself is relatively short and, of course, very polemical in nature, but he does make good points. Very good points, actually. It's really a story of the rise of the city of London and why, and of course, Cromwell, it should be added, as I think our listeners are probably well aware, he let the Jews back into England. And so you have the relationship between the merchant class, who themselves had a tendency to become Puritans. He has a good quote here I should read. He says, if their entry into the plutocracy is not easy to explain, there is no difficulty in explaining why so many merchants became Puritans. The reason was that it sounded much more dignified to protest against the crown in defense of religious liberty than an attempted evasion of taxes. Thus, under the pretext of fighting for pure Protestantism, many wealthy personages waged a great battle for political supremacy. And on the subject of Cavaliers, he says, the king's cause was supported by at least half the population of England, but a trustworthy leadership was lacking, and Parliament had the money of the City of London. The Royalists had no more than they could raise on their estates, and their family played. It was truly a war between Mammon and the legions of the lost. Mammon won. Cromwell emerged as the military dictator of the Revolution. It's the nature of the empire itself that was the issue, and why it was that England declared war on Germany in September of 1939. I think most people are aware. There's nothing really especially new to be said there, but he does provide some very cogent background to the ascendancy of the money power and its role in the empire. One of his big things was that the empire was basically a superficial and mercantile empire run for the benefits of the Jewish money power in the City of London. Because keep in mind, especially by the 20th century, I mean, these people, they controlled the Bank of England.
And people also should understand that the Bank of England is not just like our Federal Reserve of the United States, it is not a nationally controlled or owned, I should say, institution. The City of London, where it resides, is actually a sort of sovereign municipality unto itself. It has its own police force, and it's been that way since the days of William the Conqueror, if you can believe that, because it was the only region of London to hold out against that invasion. And so William basically made a deal with them and said, well, you can have your own sort of little realm over there, and we'll come to a truce. And it's been that way ever since. And that's where the banks are located, and all the sort of money laundering that they engage in today with the offshore accounts.
England, the empire, it wasn't just the war that had done it. The war was the last gasp of the empire, because the free trade system that was sponsored by the British Empire it's also its undoing, because when other countries were able to establish their own manufacturing bases, and free trade allowed them to compete on English soil with English industry. So he would say these three principles: ruthless competition, free trade at any cost, and the investment of money without any regard to blood, nation, or race are fundamental to the international capitalism in the interests of which Britain has mobilized her forces to destroy National Socialist Germany. And he also has some very Spenglerian Prussian socialist type observations about the distortions on the class system of England, which is namely that neither physical strength, creative intellect, nor nobility of character was needed. All that was required was a sound appreciation of the laws of profit and loss and the psychology of fools. Such is the path of transition from the hovel to the palace, and such as it is in England today. Only those who have lived in England without money or influence know the utter hopelessness of the system for those who have nothing but physical strength, mental ability, or character to offer. He also, another very Spenglerian insight, I think this is a good one too. Now, even in the middle of the last century, there was a reaction to this code of perpetual servitude. Great philosophers like Thomas Carlyle and evil Jews like Karl Marx had much to say on the subject. The Marxian Manifesto of 1848 was written in essentially the same language and with fundamentally the same outlook as the treaties written on behalf of liberal capitalism. Marxism was just the obverse of the capitalist coin. The capitalists wanted all private property for themselves. Marx said that there should be none at all. They used religion to cloak the vices of their conduct, and Marx replied by denouncing religion altogether as the opium of the people. So, he was a National Socialist and a fascist through and through.
Well, let me ask a sort of realistic question here. How did he see Britain actually going to fascism realistically from the empire? The people who controlled the empire with all its wealth and advantages that it conferred to them, maybe not the people, but to them, what incentive do they ever have for giving it up? And so why would they let somebody like him, did he naively expect them to just hand it over to this?
No, of course, he understood.
Mosley? Yeah.
Well, and he also, I should add, he broke from Mosley. He felt he was responsible when he was the director of propaganda for the British Union of Fascists. He was responsible largely for increasing the level of anti-Jewish agitation, which Mosley, for reasons I think we did discuss in our episode on him, was not entirely fond of. This ran into problems. There was one British paper that was willing to support the BUF, and this in particular caused him to withdraw because of the threat of Jewish advertiser money. He thought that the only hope for peace with Germany was, of course, for there to be a National Socialism in England. And no, he was not very optimistic about this. In fact, as a general rule, his whole approach to political agitation was very radical. He had to say, for example, "I have always believed in the face of experienced advice to the contrary, that he who speaks the truth with passion and conviction is better propagandist than he who burns the midnight oil, considering in what way a program can best be put before the people. There may, of course, be very different opinions on this subject, but as I once said to a colleague who told me that I was damaging my chances in politics, I'm not in politics because I want to get on, but because I feel and believe things that I consider it a duty to utter, success be damned." And I still think this attitude is appreciated better than any by ordinary people. That is to say, he understood that chances of success, of the uphill battle against the moneyed interests of the empire, was not likely to succeed. His real hopes were in a German victory.
So, given that he had these views, I mean, it still takes a certain kind of personality during the prosecution of an actual shooting war to decide that your, I guess, primary contribution is going to be these, perhaps well-written, but not ultimately persuasive, given the stakes involved and all the various propaganda and counter-propaganda on all sides, radio broadcasts. Like what?
Yeah, go ahead, Hank.
Well, I mean, what impels him to decide to luxuriate in his speaking voice rather than if he believed that strongly in these ideas, I mean, why didn't he, for instance, take up a rifle?
Oh well, he did enlist. He did enlist it once he was granted German citizenship. He did enlist in German armed forces.
Well, you also got to maximize what you're good at too. I mean, if he's, I forget who said it, but I think it was. I actually don't remember. It might have been, I was going to say Stalin, but it doesn't really make sense because they kind of control the press. But somebody said, one journalist is worth 20 soldiers. And in the sense that if you can sort of change the mindset of your enemy, that's pretty important. I mean, that's propaganda, right? And it's persuasion. And ultimately, yes, it did not persuade the vast majority of the population, but you could easily see, between the choice of him shooting a bullet down the range when there's millions of people who can do that versus he being a native English speaker living in Germany and in communication with the high command. I think that would be a more useful thing for him to do.
I guess this is kind of a broader point about propaganda in that conflict, because as far as I can tell, the only propaganda that had any sort of exterior effect on the people or the state that you were fighting was, there were substantial and extremely successful attempts at communist infiltration, convincing conversion, subversion, however you'd like to phrase it. But aside from that, I mean, there probably were instances where, having been already extremely clear for a while that, Germany had lost the war, propaganda about like, okay, here's how to safely surrender. That's the sort of thing that I could see having sort of an effect. But these broad strokes about why we fight, and specifically why we fight these guys, as far as I can tell, that's oriented completely towards your own people, your own kind of conscripted, not politically involved soldiers. It does not actually seem to have an effect on things like enemy soldiers, enemy apparatchiks in their actual governing apparatus.
How would you measure that though? Because propaganda is very subtle,
look at, like,
and it
how
acts in indirect ways.
Well, how many communist? I mean, there are tons of communist.
Oh, certainly, communism was more effective.
Over. So you can look and say, okay, communist propaganda was effective. There were, as far as correct me if I'm wrong, but there were zero kind of liberal spy rings operating in Germany. There were zero significant kind of from the actual population Nazi spy rings in the U.S. or U.K.
I don't know if that was a big of an initiative on the Germans' part either.
Well, the goal for a while was, of course, to get the British Empire to accept Hitler's hand in peace. I mean, that was, up until, that's why, of course, Dunkirk happened at all. He could have slaughtered all of those British on the shore, but he did not, because he was still hoping to sue for peace. And part of the goal, he was well listened to. People listened. He had estimates were around 18 million occasional listeners, and he had a dedicated 6 million daily listeners. And he had a very good understanding of the contradictions in British society. The fact that many people in Britain were poor and suffering while England was involving itself in something that was none of its concern. And so this was
Yeah, if I could make a very simple argument in this case, Hank asked the reasonable question, well, why was this the best thing he could be doing? Well, let me paint this example, and I don't have evidence for this, but I can imagine it being very likely or at least possible. Let's say he does a broadcast, and it persuades, let's say, 1% of that 6 million people. So that's what, 60,000 people, something like that, to maybe not work quite as hard in the wartime factory, or maybe when they see a German who's running away, not to shoot him in the back. That's a lot of people, and that's a much bigger impact than him just shooting one round of ammunition at one soldier across the field. So I think propaganda is very powerful.
He was perfectly, I should continue to emphasize, so he's perfectly happy to fight if need be. I mean, typically the British volunteers, the few that there were, they were sent typically to the Eastern Front. And Joyce, when things grew dimmer, he well expected that he would either die on the Eastern Front, or, as he was in fact, be hanged by the British Empire. I would say, let me provide his specific words on his decision to leave. He says, "For my part, the decision was easy to make. To me, it was clear on the morning of August 25th that the greatest struggle in history was now doomed to take place. It might have been a very worthy course to stay in England and incessantly work for peace, but I had one traditionally acquired or inherited prejudice, which many will think foolish and which may be logically difficult to defend. England was going to war. I felt that if, for perfect reasons of conscience, I could not fight for her, I must give her up forever. Such an argument I do not commend to anyone else, but a man is guided by more than reason alone, and in this great conflict I wanted to play a clear and definite part. In small matters it is easy enough to be guided by conventional loyalty. In great matters a man has the right to hold himself responsible to higher justice alone. And for my part, I will say that if I ever end up in Tehran broadcasting anti-American propaganda, it will be in the same spirit."
Well, I was gonna say at some point, either on air or off the air. I guess I'm doing it on air now. That, I mean, clearly you see some kindred spirit action going on with this guy. I mean, he was under similar circumstances. Obviously, we're not in a direct war, but in the sense that we are expressing somewhat unpopular opinions, although there is a fairly large minority of people who share ours, and we're doing so under anonymous circumstances because we believe that the consequences of doing this too publicly are too great, and we also believe we're more effective that way. So I can sympathize with someone like this. I don't have to agree with everything without really knowing anything he said, to be honest, but I can understand the sort of type of person who feels compelled to do what he thinks is right, even though it's very difficult and inconvenient.
Yeah, and I found a lot of his criticisms of English conservatism, because similar to the American situation, the Conservative Party in England was designed to lose. I mean, it was supposed to represent the older interests. But here's what he has a good quote here. In the English people, there lingered, however concealed, some traces of the Viking strain. There was an inherent sympathy with the acquisition of new tracts of land, and often deep down there lay the feeling that wandering, fighting, encountering danger, killing and being killed were all nearer to the spirit of eternity than the drudgery of a Victorian counting house desk. Only when one has experienced the drab and sordid conditions of life in commercial England, only when one has felt the last strain of poetry evading the human grasp, like Cressua in the relentless monotony of pounds, shillings, and pence, one can understand the latent longing for adventure, which in the popular mind blessed the transactions of the British imperialism. And he goes on to say, the function of conservatism was to provide just that element of aggressive nationalism which could win empires, whilst the liberal hypocrites from whom the empires were being won could intone the glories of universal brotherhood and occasionally sacrifice a general like Gorgon of Khartoum just to show that they were internationally minded. These Uriah Heeps, these Victorian Pharisees, whited sepulchres, dead man's bones, talked glibly about the Parliament of Man and the Federation of the World because their interest lay not in the building of an empire, but in the acquisition of a larger area for their financial depredations. As good internationalists, they must of necessity disavow such an aim, and therefore they found a most useful weapon in the remnants of the poor landed gentry who in their mind's eye were still winning the campaigns of the Civil War. Thus, when England's heroes won her battles in Strand's remote, the liberal capitalist could wring his hands and say, how horrible, after providing the money for the campaign. Truly, Loki had the giants at his mercy. He's a very poetic writer. So I think that's very relevant to the American problem. Basically, what he's saying, if it wasn't clear, is that the British Empire was not being ruled as a true empire. It was just glossing the surface and pillaging the easy skim off of these lands. And the same people who would send these boys off to die and finance these campaigns could grandstand about, the cruelties of imperialism. And you see, of course, the same thing in the United States, where the nominally, or at least up until recently, they really showed their fucking fangs lately. But the Democrat Party would always have these nominal anti-war platitudes when they were in on the same take from the war machine. And red state America is always what's tapped into to provide the trigger pullers for the again, extended liberal empire. And they do that by tapping into sentiments of patriotism and even nationalism. You wave the flag, you salute the men who died for freedom's sake, And that's how it's won. The merchants and parasites who rule this empire, they're not in it to create a true empire. They're in it for their own personal enrichment and the continued service of international capital. And they're more than happy to both take from the more simple-minded prole types who are willing to give up their own blood and treasure in the service of a very natural and instinctive drive for conquest, but more so to even just to defend the nation, as they're told. And it's these inherently noble sentiments that are tapped into for very perverse ends. And I thought that was something that really holds up today.
Well, obviously the big question is, what do we do about it? Did he have any insight other than letting or helping Germany succeed? How do we apply this?
He had many insights on what the political and economic direction of England should be. I mean,
that's a slightly different question, but I'm also interested in hearing what he had to say about that.
Well, he was a revolutionary. He wanted to see, I guess specifically, and this is similar to a lot of the other Mosleyites, he wanted to see a resurrection of the medieval guild system, a money and credit system based solely on production, and end to usury and speculation. He also was in favor of the crown, of the monarchy. He wanted a return to power of blood and the aristocracy.
Right. Yeah, so we I think we covered a little bit of that during our Mosley episode.
He would also probably advise hanging the Jews from lampposts, I should add.
Well, that's more of a intermediate step. But what you were trying to get to is, what is the system that he's actually seeking? The question I was asking, though, which is kind of what you were just saying, was how do you get to the point where you have the power to implement the society that you want? And I was kind of asking about the American case, if there's lessons that we can draw from this. And did he also have any other ideas about Britain other than just, giving sort of Hitler the free rein to do?
I understand what you're saying, Adam. He believed, first and foremost, like I said, he was a dedicated National Socialist. But to him, this was not, it did not mean being a Hitlerite. He was given more so to Thomas Carlyle than to Mein Kampf in terms of what his actual rhetoric was back when he was in England.
Okay. Could you explain that?
He believed that National Socialism or fascism, but he preferred National Socialism. He broke from the British Union of Fascists to found what he called the National Socialist League. He saw the great contradiction in British politics was that the socialists, I mentioned earlier, the sort of Spenglerian insight as international Marxism being the obverse side of the capitalist coin. They're both materialist ideologies in this way, and give no heed to blood and nation, and they're operating under the same crass materialism. So he saw that the reaction that eventually came up with the creation of the Labour Party was a reaction to the depredations of the capitalist system, but that it was done in a way that, it drove them, and this is typical of the interwar years. You find this elsewhere in Europe. This is a common observation because it's true that it's the origin of third position politics, period. And the socialists became natural internationalists, and by being internationalists, they continued to serve capital, which its fundamental function is globalizing. It is the international. It's creating standard markets.
What that comes from, though, is the seeking of the lowest cost to sell at the highest price, and you maximize the opportunities by expanding the markets, because then you have more chances for finding that stuff.
Yes. And in addition to that, of course, like these British ideas coming out of Manchester or Westminster, however you want to put it, became tools in the colonies as well. He wanted to see the empire no longer continue to expand without reason. He wanted it to consolidate what it had and improve the lives, for instance, of British India, of the colonial subjects. He saw that the colonial subjects had the same interest in this way, and that capital that is being created within the empire should stay and should be reinvested in the empire rather than invested outside of the empire. And that includes places like India.
Right. Yeah, I remember Mosley talking a lot about the home market, because he was citing, even then it was kind of amazing how much the British manufacturing industry was being undercut by, I think it was Japanese imports at the time. And he was basically saying, and this, again, it's very eerily reminiscent of the arguments you'll hear today in the financial press about, people in the City of London critiquing that and saying, well, if we close off our markets, we'll lose the opportunity to sell abroad. And he's like, no, then the people that are currently sort of losing their jobs in the UK will suddenly have a job again, and then they can buy the products that are made here. That's the sort of basic logic of autarky. That's the system in general. What it's called.
And exactly right. And he wanted to see a balance that he observed, as Mosley did as well, the decline of in English politics, the decline of the agricultural base had a direct relationship with the ascendancy of Jewish money power and the control of people like the Rothschilds over.
It's difficult to say which direction that really went in.
I didn't say which direction. I just said there's a relationship.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost tautological, unless you just have an economic collapse. If you're, especially in employment, if employment in your agricultural sector is shrinking, then ipso facto it's increasing somewhere else, or you're just having a horde of impoverished people.
Correct. And it was, of course, many would attribute this to the repeal, at least by the 19th century, of the Corn Laws. But the point in British politics of that, when you have the decline of British agriculture, and especially with the Industrial Revolution, the increased incentives, because keep in mind, when you're giving these peasants were able to live relatively comfortably. I mean, money wasn't something that they necessarily needed much of, but when you start offering this money to come into the towns and into the factories, it seemed like a lot. These people hadn't handled much money, but they had no conception of what it would actually cost to live in the city. And people are all familiar with the nature of the exploitation that went on there, but as far as British politics goes, the more the conservative base and the old aristocratic families, the old blood, they were neutered by this. I mean, the power started to shift away from them, and so the merchants began to dominate. The merchants and the Bank of England began to dominate. As for the empire, he had some very. This is one of my favorite things because it's something I've always come back to again and again. One of the most repugnant things about the British war against Germany is just the absolute hypocritical moralizing, and he has some very good observations. First, he makes the obvious point that everyone should understand, so I'll read it because it's worth stating. He says, "The history of the formation of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and many other empires is a record of violence and often ruthlessness. It's only when England's politicians assume the white mantle of virtue and sanctimoniously claim an immaculate certificate of humanity for everything connected with British imperial history, or when they accuse other nations of gaining their ends by force, that one has to observe politely but firmly that England's record in Ireland, Africa, India, North America, Malta, China, and Palestine stops her from criticizing those who may choose to employ military force in the pursuit of their objectives." And this is one of my favorite quotes. So he says, "Thus, for example, if it be said that Russia invaded Poland only because of the morals of the poor, innocent commissars had been corrupted by the wicked Nazis, the wicked Nazis had themselves been corrupted by reading, in their youth, the exploits of Raleigh, Marlborough, Clive, Hastings, Wellesley, Napier, Cordington, Roberts, Rhodes, Jamesons, Kitchener, and Wolseley, to say nothing of Hawkins, Mountjoy, Carew, and Oliver Cromwell. A serious study of these biographies by apt pupils should leave one gasping at the modesty of the military measures that Germany had recently taken in Europe. Presumably, however, Sir John Hawkins founded the slave trade in the sacred cause of democracy. Mountjoy and Carew decimated the Irish populations in the interests of small nationalities. And there can be little doubt that Kitchener's drastic treatment of the Boers in the closing stages of the South African War was merely intended to provide that mortification of the flesh which disposes the spirit more readily to grasp the celestial mysteries of international finance." That's good shit, man. I mean, your hypocrisy really just knows no bounds.
So, what did you look at all or most of the speeches that he made, at least the big ones, and did you notice any sort of evolution in his thinking and what he was communicating?
I've read, I think, most everything he's written. As far as the speeches, yeah, I've listened to many of them. It's better to just read him, though, if you want to. As far as his changes, I have a good quote on that, his patriotism, because, again, I have to remind listeners that he came from a loyalist family, and so he was brought up to venerate the crown. And he still did. I mean, he never really turned against the crown. He just saw the extent to which the crown was a nominal figurehead, and it was the Bank of England that ruled. And it was in the Rothschilds' offices that this war was decided. So as for his patriotism, here I should explain that in the course of years and experience, the basis of my patriotism had changed. It was no longer the collection of sentimental abstractions that had satisfied me in my youth. Having seen how the poor lived and how they suffered, I had realized the impossibility of a patriotism which excluded them. On the one hand, the Tory politicians were ruining the empire for the sake of international finance, and on the other hand, the mere fact that conservatives claimed a monopoly of patriotism made millions of working people detest it. I should add here that that's what drove them into international socialism. It became clear to me that it was a vain presumption to talk about patriotism until the masses of the people were given some real reason to love their country. And the only real reason conceivable was that a new and scientific economic system should abolish unemployment, poverty, and social injustice. The more I investigated the facts, the more convinced I became that the old stereotyped patriotism was a hollow sham designed to conceal the operations of financiers and preserve the privileges of an effete plutocratic class. From the outset of my political career, I was always told how unwise it was to mention the Jews. One could condemn the king in public without fear as to the consequences, but to mention the Jews was sacrilege. For some time I worked to break this evil superstition, and I believe that I had succeeded.
Yeah, what's funny about that is, absent the Jewish part, I mean, you could basically just take that out of a Tucker Carlson monologue. I mean, it's basically explaining the simple fact that the system isn't working for normal people, and the system should work for the people if at least they're going to give their allegiance to it. But the elite seem to expect it regardless, which is what is actually the most insulting part, in my opinion. But
and they always come back to demand it.
Yeah, your nation, calls you to do your duty, kind of thing.
Yeah, and even now, I mentioned earlier that I always forget which is the stupid and the evil party.
The evil party is the Democrats, the stupid party is the Republicans.
Yeah, that would be my inclination. Hank, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. You're right, Adam. It is the addition of the Jews that makes it, I think, difficult for some people to understand, because really, I mean, many of his critiques of the political and historical development of England are really probably shouldn't be too controversial to people who really know their history. I mean, who aren't liberal capitalist shills. I mean, the socialists, none of the non-national variety, could easily agree with a lot of it. However, of course, when he brings in the Jews, there's a funny thing. We mentioned the modern day. He has a good one about how it is people respond.
Well, while you're looking for that, it just reminded me of another example of this sort of people's programming kicks in when there's certain keywords used, but the ideas themselves are fundamentally agreeable to most people. And the best one I can give is that a lot of people will do these sort of man in the street interviews, and they'll start reading quotes from Mein Kampf, and they'll basically attribute it to Bernie Sanders, and then somebody on the street will be like, yeah, man, Bernie should have won, and then obviously the irony is that these ideas are fairly well accepted by most people. It's the association, though, with friend or foe, depending on how you've been programmed, is what really changes people's minds.
Yeah, no doubt. He was, of course, a very hardcore critic of the Jewish race, and he's also quite funny. He opens in his book Twilight over England, he actually opens it with a quotation by none other than Israel Zangwill. He says, this is from Zangwill, he says, pious, fanatical zealots, throttled by the Talmud coil, impious, lecherous septics, cynical stalkers of spoil, wedded neath Hebrew awning, buried neath Hebrew sod, beneath not a dream of duty, never a glimpse of God, blarneying, shivering, crawling, taking all colors and none, lying, a fox in the covert, leaping, an ape in the sun. He says, after this verdict, nothing that I have to write on the subject will seem too strong. Yeah, that's usually the case, too. He has 7 main points to sum up his criticisms of the Jew race. He says, 1, an incapacity to avoid forming a state within a state. Fact check, true. 2, complete inability to view their Gentile hosts as possessing equal rights with their own. True. Predetermined specialization in all those processes which bring high profit, hence in capitalism, almost exclusive preoccupation with finance, distribution, and exchange as distinct from productive industry, professional work undertaken either for profit or for the sake of social advancement. True. For a natural tendency to utilize social and economic advancement for the purposes of gaining political power. 5, an unholy dread of nationalism as a factor which would draw the attention to their racial nature and expose their operations. Yep. 6, the deliberate debasement of the standards of culture in the land of their sojourn. Yes. And 7, the elimination by competition of the Aryan who merely wants to get enough for himself and not more than anybody else. He also makes an observation which I've always, a lot of people, there's kind of the crude criticism of Jews that they're just greedy. I mean, that's like not even Jew 101. He
entry-level racism.
Yeah, not yet, barely, because the Jews are not they're not a stingy people. This is, I think that the Jews themselves like to cultivate that as the anti-Semitic.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think that stereotype is pretty well earned. I mean, it depends on sort of the circumstances. Like, they'll give you sort of, they pay a lot of lip service to you, definitely. But that talk is cheap. But when it comes to negotiating money, they're pretty tough. They're very tough.
Yeah, but they're happy to spend on. They're happy to spend
on themselves or their in-group or charities.
And they're not also, I mean, many Jews will drive automobiles, for example,
on themselves. That's what I mean.
Far below what they could in fact afford.
I don't know. I mean, look at Jerry Seinfeld and his collection of German cars. I mean, you explain that one to me.
So. No, Seinfeld he happens to actually love cars.
Yeah.
He has good taste, funny enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he goes in. It's probably one of the more dated chapters. I mean, his general observations about how these people operate, they hold up. He does have one funny. He mentions the great. This is one that will resonate. Is the poorer a man is, the better his chance of being anti-Jewish. He has nothing material to lose. If the rich attacks the Jews, they may expect the sort of treatment meted out to Henry Ford when he had to withdraw the famous articles in the Dearborn Independent. So,
you knew about that? That's cool. Yeah, those came out. God, it was early, right? It was early 1900s. Those were published. I mean, Ford Motor Company was founded like 1903. So, but I think it was before. It was after. It was the interwar periods. I think those were coming out. Trying to remember.
And another. Hitler had read them as well.
Yeah. Well, he was the only American that he mentioned in Mein Kampf, apparently. Henry Ford. Yeah.
Just like Ford's the only American that Joyce mentions in this book. Another good observation too, and you can see this in The Orange Man, which is that when social status and political power is divorced from the blood, divorced from the landed aristocrats. You have to play ball in a certain way that really corrupts it. And so the decline of the country in favor of the town led to the following. He says, in brief, the great migration from the countryside to the towns began. The age of mechanized man was approaching. The new plutocracy and those of the old Whigs who were naturally perverse began their final and terrible offense against the old country gentleman. It was all the more terrible because the old country families were not just uprooted and annihilated. They were subject to numerous mercantile blood transfusions until they had to undergo the final humiliation of accepting Jewish sons-in-law to save the ground to which they pathetically clung. Hits home, man.
So
where to go?
So
go ahead,
he was broadcasting from Germany. He was doing
Germany calling.
Doing this every day.
Yeah, pretty much.
And
we only do once a week. What big effort?
Yeah. What else do you know about his personal situation? Where was he living? What was his?
He lived very modestly in Germany. He was broadcasting from a small village called Ziesen, which is, I guess, south of Königs Wusterhausen, which itself is in northeast Germany.
Now, was this the sort of Reich Germany, northeast? Okay,
it's not far.
Because Berlin, was basically in the center of the country when that war was going on, and then, well, they lost a lot of territory basically. So Berlin is now like sort of East Germany, effectively, but historically speaking, that was in the middle, and that was close to obviously the capital. That makes sense.
Yeah, he was. I remember when they started bombing, when the British Bomber Command started trying to murder as many Germans as they possibly could. he would go out in the air raids, and he saw, of course, what was happening, the devastation. So I don't really think at that point he had any regrets about his decision, considering what British Empire was willing to do in the name of high capital.
I mean, I believe he said at one point, whatever happens to them, they deserve it. They deserve to get what they receive for the consequences of this war. I don't know exactly what he had in mind when he said that, but that obviously indicates that he's pretty bitter about it.
Yeah, I mean, he had all reasons to be. I mean, and I'm bitter about it. I'm bitter that my great uncle, he bombed Germans, he killed Germans. He had no business doing anything of the sort.
Well, a lot of those guys didn't have a choice.
No, they didn't have a choice, I suppose. But I mean, that's the thing worth pointing out. Like, even as it's well known, like the people who are back home denouncing him, these are the people who, these are the cowards who, as much as they would love to agitate for the war,
go with the crowd. I mean, I hate that shit.
The fact of the matter is, some of the first people to die, in fact, I believe the first British casualty of the war was a British Union fascist member. I mean, these guys, despite the fact that they wanted peace with Germany, they were motivated. The reason they were British fascists in the first place is they were motivated by a spirit of patriotism and nationalism.
Well, Mosley said what they were trying to do was stop a war, the whole thing to begin with. So,
but if they had to fight, then so be it. They'll fight.
Yeah,
and so they were the ones. These are the people who would fight. Whereas the shystas back home, they're the ones who are going to whine and lie. Really.
So do we want to get to his trial?
Yeah, sure. We can get to his trial. I don't have. I mean, it was very brief. I mean, John Amory was also executed. I think John Amory's trial lasted a whole of 8 minutes.
Well, the circumstances in which he was found guilty were cause for some criticism among probably more modern sort of readers of this event, because I think at the time, obviously, people were, tensions were running pretty high, and so a lot of hostility would be natural for anybody who was fighting on the other side. But what I understand was that they convicted him of treason despite the fact that he didn't have British citizenship. That was arguably the most controversial part of it, and the fact that
Correct.
it was done so quickly.
Yes.
But he was hanged, and he was discovered apparently by some British officers while he was taking a walk. I think it was Denmark, somewhere thereabouts.
He offered the British officers, and one of them was, of course, a Jew, and there were many of these Jews, both under the auspices of both the British Army and the American Army, who showed up like flies to a corpse following the defeat of Germany to enact the Jewish revenge imperative and brutalize as many Germans as they possibly could and inflict Talmudic justice on the entire nation. And so that, he kind of like trolled this. He was like he was in the habit of basically trolling British military people. He would greet them in his.
Apparently, he spoke to them in French. And then he went for something in his pocket, and then one of the officers shot him because he thought he was pulling a gun on him or something.
Well, they were helping with, they were collecting firewood, and he like grabbed some sticks and gave it to them.
First mistake.
And yes, they were like, "Are you William Joyce?" Well, what he was reaching for was, of course, his like pretty shit tier fake papers.
Yeah.
And he was shot through the legs by the Jew. And there was a Lieutenant Perry, I believe. Yeah, Lieutenant Perry. Which of course is not a distinctively Jewish name, but as was the case, the Jewish and American, or Jewish, both in American Army and in the British Army, they would be given false names.
Well, this opens up the big question to me: is what constitutes treason, and that is
let's
legal
discuss.
Definition you could go into, but you could also disagree with perhaps what that definition is. So, Hank, do you have any thoughts on this, since you're sort of the resident legal expert?
Yeah, I mean, the whole trial was kind of farcical, but I mean, it's not a legal proceeding. The Nuremberg trials had the same aura around them, where you've determined that this person is bad and needs to be punished, and so you assume the mantle of your kind of chosen form of punishment. And in Western democracies, that's the legal process. You don't throw them into a arena Roman style. You don't have your priest go and rip out their heart on a pyramid Mayan style. Instead, you bring them into a courtroom and you have a priest dressed in nice priest robes who makes a evaluation of the empirical evidence, etc., and ultimately condemns them to the same sort of thing. And I guess ultimately, from what I understand of the case, the only thing that the argument was whether he was a British subject at the time when he was in Germany broadcasting before he renounced his British citizenship and assumed.
I should add, Hank, he was never a British citizen.
Right. Well, so that was the question. So the argument that ultimately prevailed was, well, because he had a British passport, even though he had lied to get that British passport, he was effectively a subject who owed allegiance to the crown because he was in some sense under the protection of the crown by virtue of his passport. Thus, you've got to do what the king says and not support the king's enemies by making treasonous radio broadcasts. So, I mean, it's in terms of legal arguments, it's like, are you really going to kind of dig into the minutia of who exactly was considered a British subject for purposes of being subject to their jurisdiction based on lies and documents that they might or might not have legitimate? Like, none of this matters. The point is that it was ultimately possible to make a not completely absurd case that, well, this bastard is our bastard, so we get to kill him.
Yes, and the real question, which I should hope that our listeners know the answer to, is who is the bigger traitor to England? Was it the Churchills and the Chamberlains, or was it William Joyce and John Amory?
Well, that raises a question or a thought that I had, because I recently saw this as a definition of what a citizen is. It is somebody who is given rights effectively by a government in return for having loyalty to that government. So that refers sort of a responsibility to the government if they ask you to do something. And in many countries, that's a normal concept. In America, that's sort of a touchy subject because we have this notion of independence and freedom and individuality. But in Britain, and they don't have this concept of the First Amendment either, it's a little bit different. I think you do have, and especially given the history of the loyalty to the crown in particular, I think there's a lot more history of needing to be obedient. And I think
that's the citizen-subject distinction too.
Yeah, sure. You could put it in those terms. That makes it very clear. And so in that case, you're under the jurisdiction of whatever the fuck the crown tells you is what you're supposed to do. And so regardless of what it says in the book, effectively, you have to do what you're told.
And William Joyce was never a traitor to the crown. He was a traitor to the Bank of England and to the Rothschilds, whom he never owed allegiance.
Right. That's the sort of
this notion of, okay, you're not a traitor because you, in some sense, were metaphysically supporting the king or the parliament. Like, this is a hallowed tradition that you rebel against the king in the name of the king because the king has bad advisors, and suddenly you're being executed on the White House lawn because you tried to strangle Jared Kushner.
Many such cases.
Yeah, many such cases, hypothetically. But this never actually works. This is not how this works in reality.
Oh no,
nobody really believes this. I mean, to be frank, it's not like, you know.
Sorry, I'm just having images of a purple in the face Kushner on the floor right now. Sorry, please continue.
It's not like William Joyce was taking directives from the king. Like he was acting in opposition to the king's government, like the government that the king had appointed in order to execute his will. However fictitious and absurd that concept is, I mean, at worst, he memed himself into a ultimately personally disastrous and completely ineffective and historically irrelevant attack on his country's government, however shit tier that government was. And Winston Churchill is one of the greatest monsters of the 20th century, in my opinion. But I mean, you can at least be forthright about it, and not try to put on the guise of, but I'm very loyal to the king and the people of England. Like, no, you're trying to fight the British state. You're going to get what's coming to you if you lose that battle. The experience of the American revolutionaries is instructive. They didn't put on this facade of, you know, which actually would have been accurate historically, that, well, you know, screw Parliament. They're acting in opposition to our great and beneficent king, and we'd like to make up, but instead we're going to take some pot shots at these parliamentary troops. But if the king comes over, well, you know, he's our king. They're like, no, we're of right ought to be independent states. We don't owe any allegiance to the king, and we're going to pledge our lives to this, and we're all going to be hanged if we lose this fight. That's a more forthright way of going about it, I think, because if you're not willing to make the commitment that, like, yes, you actually are taking on a government, and you take on a government, it leaves all of this room for yourself to meme yourself into these absurd claims of loyalties that you evidently do not possess.
Well, and I guess on those notes, I'm happy to be a traitor to the American state. Despite Joyce's plea of not guilty to the charges of treason, he did, of course, expect to be hanged, which he, of course, was. And if you guys don't have anything further to say, I'll close on his final words. In death, as in life, I defy the Jews who caused this last war, and I defy the power of darkness which they represent. I warn the British people against the aggressive imperialism of the Soviet Union. May Britain be great once again, and in the hour of the greatest danger to the West, may the standard of the swastika be raised from the dust, crowned with the historic words, "You have conquered nonetheless." I am proud to die for my ideals, and I am sorry for the sons of Britain who have died without knowing why.